April 23, 1918, started like an ordinary workday. And that is what makes it hard to ignore, because nothing about that morning suggested it would end in a headline or a lawsuit, or a statistic buried in a court filing. It was simply a man stepping onto a machine he believed would change his life. And by noon, William Morrison was dead beneath it. He was 34 years old, a father of 3, a farmer in Illinois who had spent 2 years setting aside money for a Fordson tractor. Not because he loved machinery, not because he wanted to show off, but because the world was changing and he could feel it. Farms were getting larger, labor was disappearing into the war in Europe, and the men who survived would be the ones who adapted. And Henry Ford had promised adaptation at a price a small farmer could actually afford. The Fordson cost $750 when Morrison bought it, half the price of most other tractors on the market, and that price mattered more than advertising ever could. Because in 1918, $750 was not pocket change. It was a calculation. It was livestock sold. It was seasons of restraint. It was a decision made at the kitchen table with a wife who knew what risk meant. And Sarah Morrison watched her husband climb onto that machine, believing they had made the responsible choice. The Fordson had been demonstrated in town 3 weeks earlier, and the representative made it look easy. Start the engine, pull the lever, guide it straight through soil that had once demanded horses and hired hands. It was compact, it was powerful, it was modern, and most importantly, it was affordable. And in a country trying to feed not only itself but Allied soldiers across the Atlantic, modern and affordable sounded almost patriotic. The machine was marketed as a solution to wartime scarcity. Britain was starving under German U-boat attacks. American farms needed to produce more with fewer workers. And Ford's answer rolled off assembly lines with the same philosophy that made his cars famous. Mass production, lower cost, scale fast, dominate the market. By 1920, tens of thousands of Fordsons would be in fields across the United States. And by the mid-1920s, that number would climb past 600,000. But on that April morning, there was only one tractor that mattered, and it belonged to Morrison. He drove it toward the back 40 of land he had plowed for years. Land he believed he understood. Land that had never betrayed him. And what happened next would later be explained in mechanical terms, in measurements and angles and weight distribution. But in real time, it lasted about a second. The rear wheels met resistance, a buried limestone boulder hidden beneath soil he had turned for more than a decade. The tires gripped instead of slipping. The engine did what it was built to do and delivered torque. And the design of the tractor did the rest. The Fordson had a short wheelbase, 63 inches from front axle to rear, compact and maneuverable by intention, but that short frame created a pivot point. And when the rear wheels locked against something solid, the front end lifted with brutal efficiency. There was no gradual warning, no slow tilt, just physics converting forward power into upward force, and 2,700 pounds of steel rotated backward. Morrison had a moment, perhaps less than a moment, to react, and there are no records of what he thought in that fraction of time. Only the outcome. The tractor flipped and came down on him, the weight compressing his chest with a force no human body could resist. And when his son found him roughly 40 minutes later, the machine had already cooled, the engine ticking in the quiet field, the promise of mechanized progress resting on the man it had crushed. He was not the first to die this way, though the country did not yet realize there was a pattern. Morrison was the 14th documented fatality attributed to what would later be known as the rear wheel flip, and he would not be the last, not even close. The unsettling part is not that machines fail. Machines always fail in some way. The unsettling part is that this failure was predictable, and in some circles it had already been predicted, before the Fordson ever entered mass production in 1917. Ford's own engineers had tested prototypes in fields and observed a dangerous tendency. When the tractor encountered heavy resistance under load, the short wheelbase made the machine prone to rear axis rotation, a technical phrase that sounds controlled until you translate it into what it means for the person sitting on the seat. And in September 1916, the chief engineer, Eugene Farkas, documented the concern and recommended extending the wheelbase to at least 72 inches. To reduce the risk, 70 inches instead of 63, 9 additional inches of steel and design modification, which would require retooling and delay. And delay during wartime meant lost opportunity, and retooling meant increased cost. And increased cost threatened the core advantage of the Fordson, which was that it was cheaper than anything else on the market. The numbers were clear. Adding those inches would increase the unit cost by about $90 and push back production by roughly 8 months. And in a business environment defined by speed and scale, 8 months might as well have been a lifetime. Henry Ford rejected the recommendation. That decision would not appear dramatic at the time. It would not be announced to the public. There would be no press conference about inches and pivot points. Production moved forward, the Fordson rolled out as planned, and farmers across America embraced it because the alternative was falling behind. Context matters here, because in 1917 and 1918 the United States was mobilizing for war. Labor shortages were real, food demand was urgent, and Ford was not selling luxury, he was selling productivity. And productivity in wartime carries moral weight. It can be framed as necessity, and that framing makes trade-offs easier to justify. Morrison likely did not know about internal memos or engineering debates. He knew only that he needed efficiency, and the Fordson delivered that in every advertisement and every demonstration. What the demonstrations did not show was what happened when traction replaced slip, when soil provided resistance instead of give, when torque met an immovable object. The rear wheel flip was not a random malfunction. It was a consequence of design interacting with real-world terrain. And terrain does not care about marketing. After Morrison's death, there was no immediate national outcry, no recall, no halt in production. Accidents on farms were common enough to be absorbed into the background of rural life. And when Ford Motor Company acknowledged reports of backward tipping incidents, the response sent to dealers emphasized caution, operate carefully on inclines, be mindful of obstacles, exercise appropriate care. Caution is always easier to recommend than redesign. In the years that followed, the numbers would rise. In 1920, 22 fatalities were attributed to rear-wheel flips. In 1920, 128. In 1920 to 31. And each death followed the same sequence: resistance, lift, rotation, impact. Each one left behind a family that had believed they were investing in survival. The company's position did not shift dramatically during those early years. There were condolences, there were reminders about safe operation, but there was no sweeping recall, no admission that the fundamental geometry of the machine created unacceptable risk. And it is here that the story moves from tragedy to tension. Because once you know the pattern exists, once you know engineers had flagged the danger before production began, the narrative stops being about isolated accidents and starts becoming about choices. The Fordson was revolutionary, that part is true. It lowered the barrier to mechanization for small farmers. It expanded output at a time when output was needed. It represented the efficiency of assembly line philosophy applied to agriculture. And revolutions rarely arrive without cost. But the question that begins forming in the background is not whether accidents happen. It is whether the cost was understood and accepted in advance. $90 per unit, 8 months of delay, hundreds of thousands of machines sold. And somewhere in Illinois, a family adjusting to the absence of a husband and father. Morrison's death did not stop production. It did not even significantly dent sales, because the Fordson's value proposition remained intact, and in many regions farmers continued to buy them in record numbers, believing that what happened in another county or another state would not happen on their land. That belief is powerful. It allows markets to function in the presence of risk. It allows companies to continue scaling, and it allows a design flaw to replicate across landscapes. By the early 1920s, the Fordson was everywhere, and with ubiquity came normalization. The machine was no longer a novelty, it was infrastructure, and infrastructure failures are often treated as unfortunate but inevitable. What had not yet happened in 1918 was organized resistance. There were widows, there were private grievances, but there was no coordinated effort to challenge the company in court or demand structural change. That would come later, after more names were added to lists. For now, in this first phase of the story, What exists is a sequence of events that feels almost mechanical in its repetition. A man buys a tractor to stay competitive. The tractor encounters resistance. The physics of its design overpower him, and a family absorbs the loss. The difference between a story that fades and a story that endures is often documentation, and in the case of the Fordson, documentation would eventually accumulate. Internal memos, fatality counts, legal filings. But on April 23, 1918, documentation was secondary to shock, and shock in rural America did not always travel far. Morrison's neighbors would have discussed it, perhaps quietly, perhaps with the uneasy acknowledgement that farming had always been dangerous, and danger does not always translate into blame, especially when the machine responsible is also the machine promising survival. This is how patterns persist, through rationalization and necessity, through the belief that with enough care, enough skill, enough vigilance, you can avoid becoming the next statistic. But physics does not negotiate with vigilance, and design decisions do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. What began with one man under a tractor would, over the next 2 decades, become a documented toll of at least 136 farmers killed by the same backward flip mechanism, and some estimates would place the true number closer to 200, because rural deaths are not always recorded with precision. The Fordson would later be nicknamed the Widow Maker by collectors who study early models, a name that compresses years of engineering debate and human loss into 2 words. Yet in 1918, that name did not exist. There was only a machine hailed as a miracle of affordability and a field in Illinois, where progress met resistance and turned upward. The question that will follow us into the next chapter is simple, but uncomfortable. When a company knows a risk exists and calculates that fixing it will cost money and time, what responsibility does it carry for the lives balanced against that calculation? And how many warnings are enough before caution stops being advice and starts being avoidance? Morrison did not know he was part of a larger pattern. He did not know his death would be cited in lawsuits years later. He did not know engineers had measured the machine he trusted and found it wanting by 9 inches. He knew only that he needed to farm more efficiently. And that morning he believed he had chosen wisely. What he could not see was that the decision about those 9 inches had already been made, long before he ever signed the purchase order. And the consequences of that decision were now set in motion across fields far beyond his own. What happened to William Morrison was not treated as a design failure. It was treated as a farming accident, and that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because if something is an accident, then it belongs to the man who suffered it. But if it is a design failure, then it belongs to the people who built it. And in 1918, America was far more comfortable assigning tragedy to circumstance than to industry. The Fordson kept selling, not slowly, not cautiously, but aggressively, because the conditions that created demand had not changed. The war was still grinding through Europe. Food shortages were still headlines. Labor was still thin. And mechanization was no longer a luxury, but a requirement. And Henry Ford understood timing better than most industrialists of his era. He had already transformed transportation by reducing cost through mass production. And now he was applying the same philosophy to agriculture. Build fast, build simple, price low enough that hesitation disappears. The Fordson's core appeal was brutally straightforward. Traditional tractors cost between $1,500 and $2,000, which placed them out of reach for many small farmers. But the Fordson entered the market at $750, and that number alone redefined expectations. Because once a machine becomes affordable, it stops being experimental and starts becoming inevitable. And when Ford later cut the price to $625, and then even lower in the early 1920s, he was not just undercutting competitors, he was shaping the structure of the industry. By 1920, roughly 75,000 Fordsons had been sold, and by 1925, more than 650,000 were in operation across American fields. And that scale did something subtle but powerful. It normalized risk, because when a product is everywhere, individual failures feel isolated even when they follow the same pattern. Farmers did not gather in large forums to compare mechanical postmortems. They compared yields, efficiency, fuel use, and speed. And on those metrics, the Fordson often delivered exactly what it promised. It was lightweight compared to many competitors, easier to maneuver in smaller plots, capable of pulling plows that once required teams of horses, and for men trying to stretch daylight and survive shrinking margins. That capability overshadowed theoretical concerns about stability. The rear-wheel flip was not theoretical, but it was conditional. It did not occur every time the tractor met resistance. It occurred when torque combined with traction under specific circumstances, and that conditional nature made it easier to frame as operator error, or bad luck rather than structural inevitability. The design itself was a study in efficiency. The 63-inch wheelbase reduced material use, shortened the frame, and made the tractor compact. And compactness was marketed as agility, which it often was. But compactness also meant that the center of gravity sat closer to the rear axle than on longer framed machines. And when power flowed through the rear wheels and those wheels encountered something they could not climb over, the force had only one direction left to travel, upward. This was not mysterious physics, it was basic leverage. But leverage becomes lethal when human bodies are positioned directly above the pivot point. Ford's engineers had observed this dynamic during early testing, and the memo from Eugene Farkas in 1916 was not written in emotional language. It was technical, controlled, focused on measurement, recommending a minimum 70-inch wheelbase to reduce the probability of rear axis rotation under load. And the key word there was probability, because engineering rarely deals in absolutes. It deals in risk management, and risk management always intersects with cost. Extending the wheelbase would require redesigning the frame, adjusting weight distribution, recalibrating production tools, and those changes ripple outward into supply chains and pricing strategies. And in wartime conditions, speed was currency. Delay meant missed contracts, missed sales, lost advantage. When Ford rejected the recommendation, he was not announcing indifference to safety. He was prioritizing scale and affordability under pressure. And that distinction is important because it frames the coming years, not as a single moment of villainy, but as a sustained alignment of incentives. As fatalities accumulated in 1920, 1921, and 1922, each case looked similar on paper. Tractor encounters obstacle, front end lifts. Machine flips backward, operator crushed. But similarity does not automatically create consensus, especially in rural communities where mechanical mishaps were part of life. And Ford Motor Company's responses reinforced that ambiguity. Dealers were advised to remind customers to exercise caution on inclines, and when encountering obstacles, guidance that sounded reasonable on its face, because caution is always reasonable. Yet caution does not alter geometry. The tension inside this story deepens when you consider how information flowed. In the early 20th century, there were no viral videos of tractors flipping, no centralized database accessible to farmers nationwide. Reports traveled through newspapers, word of mouth, occasional legal notices, and without a unified narrative, the pattern remained diffuse. Meanwhile, production lines continued, each Fordson leaving the factory identical in its proportions, identical in its potential, and the market rewarded the company for it. Because affordability expanded access, and access translated into volume. What is often overlooked in this phase is that many farmers used their Fordsons for years without incident, and those success stories carried weight. A neighbor who plowed faster and cheaper became proof that the machine worked, and human psychology leans heavily toward visible benefits over statistical risk, especially when that risk is perceived as avoidable through skill. Yet physics does not adjust itself for confidence, and every time the rear wheels found firm purchase against resistance, the same structural vulnerability existed. Internally, the company was aware that backward tipping incidents were occurring, and correspondents acknowledged reports without conceding systemic defect, a careful line that preserved brand integrity while sidestepping admission of fault. This approach allowed Ford to maintain momentum in a fiercely competitive environment. Because the tractor market was not static, other manufacturers were innovating, refining, and positioning their own machines. And if Ford slowed production to implement structural changes that increased cost, He risked surrendering the very advantage that made the Fordson transformative. By the early 1920s, the economic logic was clear. Hundreds of thousands of units in the field, strong sales numbers, a reputation for affordability, and no legal mandate forcing redesign, and in the absence of regulatory intervention, corporate decisions default to profitability metrics. The fatalities, however, were not abstractions to the families affected. Each death altered households permanently, and as the count rose from dozens toward triple digits, a different kind of momentum began forming, quieter at first, less visible than sales charts, but persistent. Some farmers started asking more pointed questions, not about price or fuel consumption, but about stability, about what exactly caused the backward flip, about whether modifications could reduce the risk. The company's public stance remained centered on operator responsibility, emphasizing terrain awareness and careful handling. And too many observers that seemed plausible, because operating heavy machinery has always required judgment. The unresolved issue was whether judgment alone could overcome a design predisposed to leverage itself against its own operator. The second phase of the story is less dramatic than Morrison's final morning, but in many ways more consequential, because it establishes the environment in which tragedy becomes data and data becomes argument. Each additional fatality strengthened the statistical case that the problem was not random, and each sale strengthened the financial case that the product was indispensable. Those two trajectories were moving in opposite moral directions while converging economically. By the mid-1920s, the Fordson had reshaped American farming. Small operators, who once relied entirely on horses, could now plow larger acreage with fewer hands. Output increased, efficiency improved, and the narrative of progress gained credibility. And progress narratives are powerful shields against criticism, especially when they align with national priorities like feeding troops and stabilizing markets. Yet beneath that narrative, the original engineering concern remained unresolved. 9 inches of wheelbase that had been deemed too costly to implement. Before launch continued to separate the machine as built from the machine as recommended. The longer the design persisted unchanged, the harder it became to reverse course without admitting that the earlier decision had been flawed. An admission carries reputational risk that can ripple across an entire brand. So production continued, sales expanded, and the rear-wheel flip remained an intermittent but deadly possibility embedded in the geometry of every unit. This is the stage at which individual grief begins to intersect with collective awareness, though not yet in courtrooms or headlines large enough to shift policy. And the question slowly forming in the background is not simply whether the tractor is useful. It clearly is, but whether usefulness can coexist with a known structural vulnerability without crossing into negligence. In the next phase of this story, that question will stop being theoretical, because one man in Minnesota will decide that condolences are not enough, and when he starts collecting names, the pattern that once felt scattered will begin to look unified. And unified patterns are harder to dismiss than isolated tragedies. By the time the pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the deaths had stopped feeling like isolated farm mishaps and started to resemble something structured, something predictable, and predictability is what turns tragedy into liability. Internally, the warning had existed from the beginning. Eugene Farkas had written it plainly in September of 1916. Before the Fordson ever entered full production, the short wheelbase presented considerable risk of rear axis rotation under load. Extend it to at least 72 inches. That was the recommendation, not dramatic, not emotional. Just an engineering correction meant to reduce probability. And when Henry Ford chose not to implement it, he was not choosing ignorance, he was choosing a trade-off. 9 inches longer would mean redesigning the frame, recalibrating assembly tooling, slowing the production schedule by roughly 8 months, and increasing the cost per unit by about $90. And $90 does not sound catastrophic until you multiply it across tens of thousands of tractors and measure it against a market advantage built entirely on affordability. The Fordson's dominance depended on being the cheapest serious tractor available, and that difference in price was not cosmetic. It was the reason farmers who had never imagined owning mechanized equipment were signing purchase orders. Raising the price risked shrinking the very audience Ford claimed to empower. So the calculation favored speed and scale, and the machine rolled forward unchanged. When fatalities began accumulating in the early 1920s, the internal awareness did not transform into public admission. Instead, the company acknowledged reports of backward tipping incidents and advised dealers to instruct customers to exercise caution, to avoid steep inclines, to remain alert to obstacles, to operate responsibly. And those instructions sounded sensible enough to deflect deeper scrutiny, because heavy machinery has always required vigilance. But caution does not change leverage, and a 63-inch wheelbase does not lengthen because a farmer reads a warning. In 1920, 22 fatalities were attributed to rear-wheel flips. In 1921, the number rose to 28. In 1920 to 31, the upward trend was no longer subtle. Yet each incident could still be framed as unfortunate, terrain-dependent, avoidable under ideal handling. And framing matters because it shapes whether a company sees a systemic defect or a series of user errors. Meanwhile, the tractors kept selling, spreading across the Midwest, across the South, into counties where mechanization had once seemed unreachable. Farmers weighed the risks the same way they weighed weather forecasts, imperfect information, personal judgment, necessity. For many, the Fordson worked exactly as promised, plowing more acres in less time, reducing reliance on hired hands, allowing families to maintain competitiveness in a tightening agricultural economy. That success story became the dominant narrative, and dominant narratives resist interruption. Yet beneath that success lay the original engineering concern, unchanged, embedded in every chassis. What sharpened the tension was not only the rising fatality count, but the emerging documentation. That Ford had known about the structural vulnerability before mass production began. The memo did not disappear. It remained in company records. And records have a way of resurfacing when someone is motivated enough to look. In Minnesota, that motivation would take the form of Robert Hutchinson, whose brother had died beneath a Fordson in a backward flip that mirrored Morrison's. Same sequence, same physics, same irreversible outcome. Grief does not automatically become activism, but in Hutchinson's case, it evolved into determination, and determination seeks evidence. He began collecting names, not rumors but documented cases, families who had lost fathers, sons, brothers under nearly identical circumstances, and as he assembled the list, the pattern solidified. 87 deaths documented by 1924, each one tied to the same design mechanism. And 87 is a number large enough to challenge coincidence. Hutchinson hired a lawyer, and what had been a dispersed series of farm tragedies began converging toward a courtroom. In January 1925, a lawsuit was filed in federal court, Hutchinson versus Ford Motor Company, seeking $2.5 million in damages, and more significantly, demanding a mandatory recall and redesign of every Fordson tractor in America. That demand shifted the narrative from compensation to accountability, because compensation can be negotiated quietly, but recall implies systemic fault. Ford's legal team fought the case for 18 months, contesting liability, disputing causation, emphasizing operator responsibility, and during that period the tractors did not vanish from fields. Production had already saturated the market with hundreds of thousands of units, and every one of them retained the same geometry. The lawsuit forced internal documents into sharper focus, including the 1916 memo recommending a longer wheelbase. And once such evidence enters legal argument, it reframes earlier decisions. What might once have been described as a strategic compromise begins to resemble foreknowledge. The $90 increase per unit became more than a line item. It became a symbol, because when contrasted with a human life, $90 feels disturbingly small, and symbols drive outrage more effectively than spreadsheets. Still, Ford did not immediately capitulate, and the absence of an early recall reinforced the perception that economic momentum outweighed moral concession. The broader agricultural community watched closely, some skeptical of the lawsuit, others quietly supportive, because challenging a corporation of Ford's scale required both evidence and persistence. Meanwhile, fatalities continued, though exact documentation varied, and rural reporting remained inconsistent. Estimates would later place total documented deaths between 1917 and 1940 at least 136, with some suggesting the real figure approached 200. Each additional death strengthened the plaintiff's moral argument, but did not automatically guarantee legal victory, because establishing causation in product liability cases requires navigating technical testimony, statistical interpretation, and corporate defense strategies. The longer the case dragged on, the more it tested whether the issue would be resolved through law or through market pressure. And market pressure was already building from another direction. Competitors had observed both the Fordson's dominance and its vulnerability. And innovation rarely pauses when a leader stumbles. In June 1927, International Harvester released the Farmo, a tractor featuring a wider wheelbase, improved stability, and a price point of $825, higher than the original Fordson, but positioned as a safer, more advanced alternative. The timing was significant because while Ford had resisted redesign under legal scrutiny, competition introduced a new variable, consumer choice. The Farmo's wider stance implicitly addressed the same stability issue that Farkas had identified years earlier. And farmers now faced a comparison not just of price, but of perceived safety. This is where the calculus shifted, because lawsuits threaten payouts, but competitors threaten market share, and for a company built on scale, market share is existential. Within 3 months of the Farmo's release, Ford ordered a comprehensive redesign of the Fordson. The new Model N, introduced in 1929, featured a 76-inch wheelbase, 13 inches longer than the original 63, along with reworked weight distribution intended to reduce the likelihood of rear-wheel flip by an estimated 85%. The redesign validated, indirectly but unmistakably, the original engineering concern. If lengthening the wheelbase significantly reduced the hazard, then the hazard had indeed been tied to the original dimensions. The Hutchinson lawsuit was settled quietly in 1928 for an undisclosed amount, without a court-mandated recall, and more than 500,000 original Fordsons already in circulation remained in use. The recall demand had not been granted, and the machines continued operating in fields across the country, some safely, some fatally. The story at this stage is no longer about whether the design flaw existed. It is about what ultimately compelled change. Was it moral responsibility, legal pressure, or competitive threat? The sequence suggests that while litigation exposed internal awareness, it was the introduction of a rival tractor with improved stability that accelerated redesign. That conclusion complicates the narrative because it implies that market forces accomplished what moral appeals alone could not. Yet even after the Model N entered production, the legacy of the original Fordson persisted, its early models remaining in operation into the 1930s, contributing to an additional estimated 40 deaths before most were finally scrapped or replaced. By 1930, nearly every major tractor manufacturer in America had adopted longer wheelbases and better weight distribution, integrating safety considerations more deliberately into design. And the cumulative toll of the Fordson era influenced that industry-wide reckoning. Engineers began calculating what happens when a machine flips, not just how efficiently it pulls. Roll bars and later safety features would emerge over time. But the underlying lesson had already been paid for. The $90 saved per unit in 1917 had multiplied into a body count that reshaped manufacturing standards. The Fordson remains a symbol of both innovation and oversight, a machine that democratized mechanization while embedding a preventable hazard into its core geometry. The question that lingers is not whether Henry Ford was a visionary. He clearly was, nor whether the Fordson transformed agriculture. It undeniably did. But whether the choice to prioritize immediate affordability over extended stability was an unavoidable wartime compromise or a preventable misjudgment with measurable human cost. That ambiguity is what keeps the story alive, because it forces the listener to weigh context against consequence and to decide whether the 9 inches that were deemed too expensive in 1916 became the most costly measurement in the tractor industry's history. By the time the lawsuit moved through the courts, the story had outgrown the fields where it began. Because once you put a pattern under oath, it stops being rumor and starts becoming record. Robert Hutchinson was not a professional activist. He was a farmer who had buried his brother. And what pushed him forward was not ideology, but repetition. The same description every time. Rear wheels hit resistance, front end rises, machine flips, man crushed. And when you hear the same sequence often enough, it stops sounding like bad luck and starts sounding like design. Hutchinson's list of names was not dramatic on its own, just pages of men and dates and locations. But lists carry weight because they strip away ambiguity. They show that what seemed scattered is actually connected. And by 1924 he had documented 87 deaths tied to the same backward tipping mechanism. 87 is not a fluke. It is not a headline that fades. It is a pattern that demands response. When the lawsuit was filed in January 1925 seeking $2.5 million in damages and a mandatory recall of every Fordson tractor in the country, the stakes changed because money can be negotiated. But recall implies admission, and admission threatens reputation. Ford Motor Company responded, as large corporations often do, with lawyers and strategy, contesting causation, emphasizing proper operation, questioning whether terrain and user handling were the true variables. The legal battle stretched for 18 months, and during that time tractors continued working in fields across America. Because lawsuits do not pause agriculture, and agriculture does not wait for verdicts. The quiet reality was that more than 500,000 original Fordsons were already in circulation. And even if the court had ordered a recall, implementing it would have been a logistical and financial undertaking on a massive scale. So the company fought, and the longer the case lasted, the more complex the narrative became. Internally, the existence of the 1916 memo recommending a longer wheelbase could no longer remain abstract, because in a courtroom context it becomes evidence of foreknowledge, and foreknowledge reshapes responsibility. The $90 saved per unit resurfaced as a point of tension, because once you frame it against a list of 87 names, cost reduction feels different. Still, litigation is slow, and public opinion in the mid-1920s did not move with the speed we expect today. There were no televised hearings, no viral campaigns, only printed reports and local conversations. While the lawyers argued, the market kept moving, and in business, markets often decide faster than judges. In June 1927, International Harvester introduced the Farmo, a tractor that entered the same agricultural space, but with a wider wheelbase and improved stability. Priced at $825, more expensive than the earliest Fordsons, but positioned as refined and safer. The Farmo did not need to accuse the Fordson directly. Its design spoke quietly but clearly. Wider stance, better balance, fewer reports of backward flips. Competition reframes conversations because it gives customers options, and options shift leverage. Farmers who had once compared only prices were now comparing geometry and stability. And that comparison mattered. Within 3 months of the Farmo's release, Henry Ford ordered a comprehensive redesign of the Fordson. And that timeline is difficult to ignore, because for years the company had resisted structural changes despite fatalities and lawsuits. Yet competitive pressure produced action quickly. The redesigned Model N debuted in 1929 with a 76-inch wheelbase, 13 inches longer than the original 63, along with adjustments in weight distribution intended to reduce the likelihood of rear-wheel flips by an estimated 85%. That change validated what the early engineering memo had warned: longer base, better stability, lower risk. The redesign did not come with a public apology, and it did not arrive with a nationwide recall of earlier models. It simply entered the market as an improved product, and in doing so, it acknowledged, indirectly, that improvement had been possible all along. The Hutchinson lawsuit was settled quietly in 1928 for an undisclosed amount, without a court-mandated recall, which meant that more than 500,000 original Fordsons remained in operation, scattered across farms where owners made their own risk assessments. Some would operate for years without incident. Others would join the growing count of fatal accidents. An estimated 40 additional deaths attributed to the rear-wheel flip after the redesign had already been announced. The absence of a recall left responsibility distributed among individuals, because if the company does not demand withdrawal, the burden shifts to the farmer to decide whether to keep using the machine he has already paid for. And many did, because replacing equipment is expensive, and admitting danger requires resources not everyone has. By the early 1930s, the tractor industry had absorbed the lesson. Nearly every major manufacturer extended wheelbases and re-examined weight distribution. Safety became a design consideration rather than an afterthought. And while roll bars and protective structures would evolve over time, the awareness that machines could pivot backward with lethal force had entered engineering consciousness. The Fordsons' legacy became complicated. It had undeniably democratized mechanization, making tractors accessible to small farmers who would otherwise have relied on horses. For years longer, it had contributed to increased food production during and after World War I. It had embodied the efficiency of assembly line thinking applied beyond automobiles, and yet it had also embedded a vulnerability that cost at least 136 documented lives between 1917 and 1940, with some estimates placing the true toll closer to 200. Collectors in later decades would refer to early Fordsons as widowmakers, not as a marketing term but as a historical shorthand. And that nickname compresses years of incremental decisions into a single phrase. What makes this phase of the story unsettling is not only the number of deaths, but the order of events. Warnings before production, fatalities after release, lawsuits demanding recall, redesign triggered by competition rather than court mandate. The sequence suggests that economic incentives can outweigh moral persuasion until a rival shifts the balance. That does not erase the Fordsons' contributions, nor does it reduce Henry Ford to a caricature of indifference. But it forces a harder evaluation of how progress is priced. If extending the wheelbase by 9 inches in 1916 would have reduced the risk substantially, then the choice to proceed without that modification becomes central. Context matters: wartime urgency, labor shortages, pressure to produce affordable equipment. All of it shaped the decision. Yet context does not reverse physics, and it does not resurrect those crushed beneath steel. The redesigned model proved that the hazard could be mitigated, which leaves an uncomfortable space between what was possible and what was prioritized. By the time production of the original Fordson ceased in America in 1928, the narrative had already shifted from innovation alone to innovation with consequence. The machines lived on in Ireland and England with safety modifications, but the American fields that first embraced them carried the heavier legacy. When we look back at this chapter now, it reads less like a simple story of corporate neglect and more like a study in incentive structures, where affordability, speed, and market share aligned on one side and long-term safety adjustments aligned on the other. And the initial alignment prevailed until competition altered the equation. What remains is the question that outlasts both lawsuits and redesigns: whether the deaths were an unavoidable cost of rapid industrial advancement, or whether they represent a preventable chapter in which a different decision at the outset could have preserved both progress and lives. The answer depends on how one weighs 9 inches of steel against the urgency of a nation at war and the pressure of a market in motion. And that balance is what continues to make the Fordson story linger long after the last of its early models left the fields. When the redesigned Model N arrived in 1929 with its 76-inch wheelbase and rebalanced weight distribution, it did not come with a confession. It came with specifications, and specifications are quieter than apologies. There was no nationwide recall pulling original Fordsons from fields, no public acknowledgement that 9 additional inches might have prevented years of fatalities. There was simply a new machine offered to the market, improved, more stable, engineered in a way that addressed the very instability identified before the first unit had ever shipped. Within engineering circles, the change spoke clearly. Extending the wheelbase significantly reduced the likelihood of rear-wheel flip. Estimates suggested an 85% reduction in risk, and that statistic alone reframed the earlier decision. Because if the danger could be mitigated so dramatically by altering geometry, then the earlier geometry had indeed carried measurable hazard. Yet by 1929, more than 500,000 original Fordsons were already working American soil. Machines purchased in good faith, machines many farmers could not afford to replace immediately. And without a mandated recall, the responsibility shifted silently onto the owners. Continue using what you have or invest again in something safer. For some, the decision was simple. If the tractor had operated for years without incident, it felt reliable enough, and replacing it meant expense during an era that would soon be defined by economic collapse. For others, particularly families who had witnessed backward flips firsthand, the risk calculation changed. Still, even after the redesign entered production, original models remained active through the early 1930s, and an estimated 40 additional fatalities occurred before most were finally retired or scrapped. Those deaths occupy a difficult space in the narrative, because by then a safer configuration existed. Yet the earlier machines remained legally and commercially in circulation. The Hutchinson lawsuit had been settled quietly in 1928 for an undisclosed amount, without the sweeping recall that plaintiffs had sought, and the settlement closed a legal chapter without fully resolving the moral one. What ultimately forced change was not a court order but competition. International Harvesters Farmall had demonstrated that stability could be improved while remaining commercially viable. And once that alternative stood in the marketplace, the calculus shifted from whether redesign was affordable to whether failing to redesign was strategically sustainable. This sequence matters because it suggests that market forces succeeded where legal pressure alone struggled, and that implication complicates simple narratives of corporate guilt or innocence. Henry Ford was neither unaware of engineering concerns nor immune to competitive threat, and the Fordson story sits precisely at the intersection of those realities. The machine had transformed American farming. That part is not disputed. By lowering the barrier to mechanization, it enabled small farmers to compete, to expand acreage, to increase output during a period when global demand for food was urgent. And in doing so, it contributed to economic resilience during and after World War I. Innovation rarely emerges without trade-offs, but trade-offs become contentious when they are quantified in human lives. Between 1917 and 1940, at least 136 documented fatalities were attributed to the Fordson rear-wheel flip, with some historians suggesting the real number may have approached 200 due to incomplete rural reporting. And each of those cases shared a mechanical pattern rooted in wheelbase length and weight distribution. By the early 1930s, the broader tractor industry had absorbed the lesson. Longer wheelbases became standard. Engineers more deliberately calculated center of gravity under load, and over time additional safety features such as protective frames and roll bars would enter agricultural equipment design. Those improvements did not arise in a vacuum. They were informed by experience, by documented incidents, by lawsuits and competitive redesigns. In that sense, the Fordson's body count became part of the foundation upon which modern safety standards were built, a harsh form of tuition paid in advance of reform. Today, early Fordsons reside largely in museums and private collections, admired for their role in industrial history, sometimes nicknamed widow makers by collectors who understand the darker side of their legacy. And that nickname captures the tension embedded in the machine's story. Revolutionary and flawed, empowering and dangerous. The uncomfortable core of this narrative remains the decision made in 1916, whether extending the wheelbase from 63 inches to 72 inches, at a cost of roughly $90 per unit and an 8-month production delay, would have significantly reduced the subsequent toll. Hindsight sharpens moral clarity, but it does not erase the context of wartime urgency, labor shortages, and competitive ambition. Still, the existence of a feasible mitigation prior to mass production prevents the story from settling into inevitability, because inevitability implies no alternative path, and here an alternative was documented. What does this mean beyond the Fordson itself? It means that every safety standard in modern machinery carries an origin story, often rooted in earlier oversight, and that companies operate within incentive structures where speed, cost, and scale exert constant pressure against caution and delay. The Fordson case illustrates how those pressures can align in favor of rapid deployment, even when engineers flag potential risk, and how correction may arrive only when legal or competitive forces tip the balance. For the families of William Morrison, Robert Hutchinson's brother, and the many others whose names appeared in court filings, the redesign came too late to alter personal outcomes, and that reality is not softened by industry-wide progress. At the same time, it is possible to acknowledge both the tractor's transformative impact and its preventable hazard, to recognize that innovation can coexist with misjudgment, and that industrial advancement often carries lessons learned at human expense. In the end, the Fordson story resists a simple label. It is not merely a tale of corporate villainy nor solely a triumph of affordable engineering. It is a case study in how decisions about inches and dollars can ripple outward across decades, shaping lives far removed from factory floors. When we look at a modern tractor equipped with stability controls and protective structures, we see the visible outcome of accumulated experience. And part of that experience traces back to a 63-inch wheelbase chosen in 1916. Whether one views Henry Ford's choice as pragmatic wartime calculation or as an avoidable compromise depends on how one weighs urgency against foresight, cost against precaution. What cannot be disputed is that the decision carried consequences measured not only in balance sheets, but in funerals, and that those consequences eventually altered the trajectory of an entire industry. The Fordson helped feed a nation and its allies. It lowered the cost of mechanization. It expanded opportunity, and it also left behind a record of deaths tied to a known vulnerability. Holding those truths together is uncomfortable, but it is precisely that discomfort that gives the story its endurance, because it forces us to confront how progress is engineered, how risk is assessed, and how easily 9 inches can become the difference between stability and catastrophe.